You know, I remember making a video last year about millennial. I believe it was Millennial X, so it's 10th incarnation, 10 years of millennial. And I think what I remember most about it was that millennial was becoming somewhat of like an established tradition amongst sort of, what do you call them, like rightist kind of social media enjoyers. And I mean, I've enjoyed it for years, but I do remember thinking that about a year ago, it kind of felt like millennial was really kind of coming into its own, so to speak. Flash forward to the most recent millennial, I've kind of got a slightly different sort of vibe to it now, as it were. Not like negative at all. No diminishment in quality or anything like that. Just more just a kind of sort of nuanced change of my own perspective, maybe maturation as a viewer. I don't know. Um, I just wonder if anyone else kind of shared a similar sentiment, which I'll elaborate on. So go back in time, several years ago, when the big tent was like a thing. Um, millennial was in its infancy, its conception at the time. It had a kind of like an upstart kind of vibrancy and a sort of like buoyancy to it. I remember watching it at the time, just like avidly. Like I think there were a couple of years where I sort of literally just kind of binge watched like every interview live. So, needless to say, I really enjoyed it. Uh, it was sort of an integral part of my Christmas calendar, and I always look forward to it. And this most recent year, admittedly, I hadn't been sort of like glued to my screen watching as in previous years. Um, Reason I think one like my own just personal situation. I don't have as much time as I used to have anymore, and I guess well I don't know maybe call it back then. Perhaps maybe I had more of a sort of kind of like kind of youthful kind of excitedness and anticipation for it. Like a kid waiting to open their Christmas presents. I guess now maybe I'm just a bit more, just kind of just older and more just grizzled. Um, but I think also, and this isn't a criticism, um, everything, and not just millennial, by the way. After a while, it can end up becoming a little bit sort of formulaic. So you know what to expect, and therefore there's a bit of like predictability there. Whereas when it first started, like you remember like the Nightmare stream, just like there was this kind of like madcap, sort of like riotous, just chaotic carnivalism to it. Um, it's just that's always going to sort of diminish in time. It's not going to be the same. And again, I feel like kind of millennials always innovated. I mean, like even recently with the Christmas banquets, I think that was a great idea and kind of keeps it feeling fresh. So I still think on the whole, millennials really good objectively, but I think you know it can kind of feel like a bit tinged with kind of like almost like melancholy nostalgia. Like you you can never quite have that same kind of feeling, you know, the same kind of vibe again. It's always going to be kind of, in a sense, kind of, you remember it with like rose tinted glasses. It's never going to be the same. Um, but there's also a kind of sense that it does feel like a part of this kind of like this lost past, and that it's like a different world, and the Christmas festivities are kind of like a part of a recurring kind of like hypnotic of mass collective remembrance where everyone just kind of all gets together again. But I feel like as time sort of passes, because there isn't this kind of continuous narrative anymore, there's no like through line of coherent alternative sort of rightist thinking and dialogue discussion as freely as they used to be. And so the most prominent social media activists and influencers, if they're there at all, they're either highly censored or they're very diminished, or just in a lot of cases, they're just gone. They're just not there anymore. And so this kind of organic sense of community, which we sort of had via the big tent, it just isn't really there anymore. It doesn't feel the same. Now, there are certain groups, like there are elements of cultural output still there, but it doesn't have that kind of grand feeling of community like it once had. Now, and there are very encouraging signs IRL, we've discussed before, so like, new communities fomenting, like the Woodlander Initiative, Arvel's Return to the Land in America, and that's great. But online, and this is perhaps kind of like the ironic thing, again, you just don't have this kind of extended cultural network anymore, where it's not as readily available. And so there's a certain sense in which millennial, it doesn't feel inorganic or anything like that, but it's just that there's no sense of like a feeling of real community, sort of like word of mouth, in the way that it used to be. And like the scope depth of it just doesn't quite feel the same. And again, at no fault of millennials. Again, to stress, it's not even a criticism of millennial or millennial woes, because even though I haven't watched much of the last one, which what I have watched, I've enjoyed. I just feel like it's a shame that a lot of what was once like a vital community, it felt vitalistic. It just doesn't have an easy, like a natural place anymore. It's kind of scattered amongst like the chthonic winds of entropy. It's it's in like that, and that's everybody. And annually, it's like herding wildebeest. We all just kind of eventually we'll find a way back together again, which is nice. But for me, I just feel like completely out of the loop after a year. I feel like I've just gone off gallivanting, and then eventually you just find your way back, and you've lost this kind of narrative. You don't know what's going on anymore, who's who. And for me, with my last video, that like the aforementioned slumber that I've been in, it's can feel a little kind of not alienated, but just detached in a way. It takes me back to when talked about needing a presence on YouTube, like building it and then maybe transplanting it onto alternative media and platforms. Maybe it's going to take years, and for people like Woes, I believe is still banned on YouTube. That's an impossibility. So it's really tough, but perhaps as groups are slowly kind of regathering again in the real world, maybe we can see this kind of proportionately being more reflected in the online diaspora again, on the interwebs, which is again a kind of like an ironic full circle thing. It's like finally the like real world meet space interactions again. But oh no, let's all get back online again because the internet feels empty. I mean, it's kind of silly, but one thing that did strike me with Millennial 11, I believe the last one was, I'll call it Log Cabin Millennial, which by the way I really like the kind of the cozy like lo-fi aesthetic, sort of chill vibes of the log cabin. For me though, there was a decidedly, certainly by the end of it, a more kind of somber tone that struck, and that kind of rose up in the memorials video, which is like a new innovation to Millennial. It is rather sobering to hear of people once part of this movement that are no longer with us anymore. Particularly for me, the loss of Antidem. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. I think later on he sort of changed his name, became like Anno Domini something. I'm not sure, but anyway, yeah, Antidem. I wasn't hugely familiar with his writings so much, but I wasn't hugely familiar with his writing so much, but the impression I had from him on Millennial and in his past interactions with Woes was that he came across as like a very grounded kind of like an everyman, but in the kind of like rural Americana sense. down to earth, but in a kind of keen, observant sort of way, which for me was refreshing because I'm coming from the UK, so getting that perspective across the pond, it always feels interesting to me, and in a way, somewhat sort of relatable as well, because you've got this kind of welcoming alternative viewpoint from another land, but it sort of chimes with you. It sort of resonates in a certain way, and that's always kind of reassuring. And I really like that about Anti-Dem, and just the kind of just a general vibe where I found him, just interesting generally and engaging, just anyway. So, really was a kind of a part of the kind of the sort of passive, the kind of like the backbone of like the kind of feel, the community of the alternative right at the end of the day, and when help give it life, and when that dies, some of that essential vigor and vitality, it dies with it, in the embers of a log cabin in Millennial. And with that, I think, a decidedly more kind of funereal tone to proceedings, but perhaps it's a timely reminder of quite literally time passing on by. Things change and things are in flux, and ultimately it's a reminder, I think, of things that matter. Community, friendship, family, things that tend to be forgotten, and that all of this needs to be regenerated with new ideas, new blood, new people. There is, I think, ultimately an optimistic outlook, as as I've said, IRL, there's reconnection, people getting together more and more, not just with us and within the alternative community, but with the advancements of like local politics. The Overton window's noticeably shifted rightwards more. What with Restore Britain and their successes, their blossoming recently, and an awakening and increasingly incensed public, scarily enough. And thank you to Keir Starmer for that. So there is a dim light at the end of the tunnel. Very dim, but it is there. Hopefully we can all, we can keep making a way, shuffling away towards it, and we find each other again at the end of it and see what's out there. Or, maybe we don't quite get there, and we'll just have to see each other at the next millennial instead, which is a good thing in its own way. So, thanks for that, and I'll see you in the next vid. Still got to watch the Morgoth Christmas special yet. I haven't seen that, so I have my popcorn ready for that. Right. See you.